maybe text 24. Maybe text 24. In the Mahabharata, there is a debate that goes on between the Sankhyas and the Yogis. So, the Mahabharata is a very long book. The Gita is less than 1% of the Mahabharata. Gita is about 700 verses. The Mahabharata is about 100,000 verses. So the Gita is a very, very small part of a much larger book. And for the most part, the Gita is a standalone text. You can just read it on its own, divorced from the context that the Mahabharata provides, and it makes good sense. However, although the Gita works as a standalone text, when you understand the background of the Mahabharata, the Gita definitely becomes more meaningful. For example, you could listen to a piece of music, a song, and the song may be beautiful in its own right. However, if you understand the lyrics, sometimes when people sing, you can't understand the lyrics. Just the way the voice gets modulated, you may not be able to follow all the lyrics. But then when you learn the lyrics of the song, your appreciation for it grows because you know what it's actually saying. So although a piece of music may be beautiful in its own right, and although just the sound, the melodic sound of the singer's voice may be beautiful in its own right, if you understand what's actually being said, then your appreciation will skyrocket. Similarly, by understanding the background of the Gita and the Mahabharata, your appreciation for what the text is saying will increase. So, there are two main competing schools of thought in the Gita that fight in the pages of the Mahabharata. And those are the followers of Sankhya and the followers of Yoga. Sankhya means to enumerate. So Sankhya was similar to the elemental science that you have nowadays, kind of a simplified form of quantum physics. If you look at the elemental chart, it breaks the world down to molecules, carbon, helium, oxygen, so on and so forth. It breaks the world down to molecules. And then it can be broken down further. Like a molecule of water, H2O, is made up of two atoms of H2O. So two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. That makes up. Now, so you can break down molecules into atoms. You break down atoms into subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are like protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then you can break it down further into subatomic particles like neutrinos and gluons and bosons, which are the smallest forms of matter that we've found. But when you look at like a periodic chart of the elements, it gives you the basic matter that exists. I think 140 or 150, whatever the amount of elements are, base elements are in the universe, breaks it down for you. Sankhya did that in ancient India. It broke the world down to 25 or 26 elements. Then, like Trika Shaivas up in Kashmir, they broke it down further into 40 some odd categories. But the normal ancient list, thousands of years ago, was 25 or 26, depending on whether you accepted that God existed. And the critical distinction made in breaking the world down into its constituent elements was to break the world down into spirit and matter, or Prakriti and Purusha, to use the language of Sankhya. Prakriti and Purusha. You could use a bunch of different words, probably use Brahman would probably be an okay word for Purusha. You could say Atma, the soul, the self, the divine on one hand, and then you could say matter on the other. So Prakriti, Maya, Pradhan, Mahat. There's a bunch of words which are used somewhat interchangeably in many verses. Sometimes they take on a much more specific technical meaning, but these words get used throughout Vedic literatures to refer to matter or spirit. And then an instance of spirit matter is the soul and the body. So Sankhya's big contribution as the backbone of all Indian philosophy was to notice that there was a difference between consciousness, between life and matter, between spirit and matter, between people and things, between inert, dead matter and then the life forms that utilize that matter. That's Sankhya. And Sankhya in the Mahabharata is a passive school that is interested in theory, interested in dispassionate analysis, interested in meditation, and distinguishing fact from fiction. As such, the followers of Sankhya were largely inactive, kind of like what you would think of in terms of monastics. They don't have a job per se, they live aloof and they think and contemplate. It's a contemplative school. Now what's funny is normally you think of that as being the yogis. Normally if you were to ask anybody, including people in India nowadays, what do yogis do? They would say they're contemplative, they live in caves, they're divorced from the world, they're renunciates. So amazingly, the word yogi is more or less synonymous with the contemplative, monastic, ascetic type person I just described as being a follower of Sankhya. Just like nowadays the word tyagi and the word sannyasi mean the same thing. They're used interchangeably. In modern Hindi, tyagi, sannyasi will be used synonymous. Right? Yes or no? 100%. Yeah. But the Gita actually has a whole section of the 18th chapter which is dedicated to distinguishing between tyag and sannyas. So obviously for them, they weren't the same terms. So Sankhya and Yoga were also distinct terms. The yogis, in contrast to the followers of Sankhya, the yogis were active, they dealt with the world, they interfaced with the world, they made moves, they were pragmatic, they were practical, they were involved. And so Krishna is trying to settle a debate which you see in the pages of the Mahabharata and which had raged at least for hundreds, if not thousands of years in ancient India between these two schools of thought, Sankhya and Yoga. Amazingly now, when you look at schools of Indian thought, Sankhya and Yoga are normally put together. It's Sankhya Yoga or Nyaya Vaisheshika and then Uttara and Purva Mimamsa. There are 6 schools, primary schools, and they're put into three groups of 2. So Sankhya and Yoga are merged together, but they're not 100% correct. They're not 100% merged together. It's kind of later they became merged together in people's minds. And really every school follows Sankhya because any Indic school of spirituality does believe in spirit and matter, and therefore the backbone of any school is going to be Sankhya. But Krishna is trying to come up with a samanvaya or a harmonic resolution to the fight between the Sankhya-vadis and the yogis. And so Krishna's trying to walk a middle path and resolve this debate. And so Krishna's resolution is you should be detached. That's like the followers of Sankhya. But you should do your duty. That's like the yogis. And that yoga ultimately is doing your duty with a detached mindset. Therefore, yoga becomes inclusive of Sankhya, and Sankhya would be partial. Sankhya would be A, and yoga would be A, B. All the benefits of A, along with things that are not included in A, namely B. So if you have, like a set of numbers, and one set of numbers has a 1, and the other set of numbers has a 1 and a 2, then everything you get from the set of 1, you can get from the set of 1 and 2. And so therefore, yoga becomes more complete if everything Sankhya has is valuable, and some stuff that Sankhya doesn't have, namely doing your duty. That's pretty much been what's been discussed for the second, third, and fourth chapters. The second chapter was Sankhya and Yoga. Yoga was also called Buddhi Yoga. The third chapter was Karma and Jnana Yoga, and those terms were made synonymous with Sankhya and Yoga, because it said Karma Yogena Yoginam, Jnana Yogena Sankhyanam, the Karma Yoga of the yogis, the Jnana Yoga of the Sankhyas. And so it's made clear that these terms, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga, kind of popular terms nowadays, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of action, are synonymous with Sankhya and Yoga from the second chapter, because Krishna literally puts them together in juxtapositions and says the Sankhya, the Jnana Yoga of the Sankhya, Sankhyanam, the Jnana Yoga of the Sankhya's, Karma Yogena Yoginam, and the Karma Yoga of the yogis. So that's the third chapter. And then that evolves into this idea of yagna, of doing your duty even when you're not detached. And then you have Dravya Maya Yagya and Jnana Yagya, the Yagya which is comprised merely of matter, and the Yagya which is in knowledge. Yagya means sacrifice. And then that becomes, in the fifth chapter that we're looking at, Sannyasa and Yoga. That sannyas and sankhya can also be used interchangeably. So what we've got thus far, and that was just, I just want to go through and legitimately go through the language for everybody. But what we've got thus far, if you don't remember everything I said, what we've got thus far is we have Krishna explaining that a yogi is renounced, but not to the point where the yogi does not do their duty. A yogi does their duty dispassionately, as they're required to, without expectation of reward, without looking at the result. Therefore, a yogi is a renunciate, a sannyasi, a sankhya. But he's more because he's also doing his duty and not merely renouncing the world. And then the result of that is you become self-realized. It works as a path of self-realization. This is a way of getting disentangled from the world. And Krishna is now describing what that process looks like. And he's describing a self-realized soul. And he's all, in answer to Arjuna's question, he's also telling us how to be self-realized, because we can then follow this path. He's also telling us what to look for in other people. And he's giving us a general education of what self-realization looks like. And we're now on text 24. No, I'll just read it. I'm just reading it myself. Thank you. Ya antasukko antar arama tata antar jyotir eva yaha. One who is antasukko. This is a bahuvrihi samas. It's a compound. It's when you say in English, you can say the red coats are coming. The red coats is a way of referring to the English soldiers who wore red coats. Or sometimes Krishna is called Pitambar. Pitambar means yellow dress. But in Sanskrit, you can make a conjunction of two words, red coats, and then that means the person who's wearing a red coat. Sometimes you'll refer to the person who's wearing a red coat as a red coat. You're not literally saying the red coats are coming. It doesn't mean a bunch of red coats are coming. It means a bunch of humans wearing red coats are coming. So anyway, a similar thing is happening here. One who is antasukko, whose happiness is within. Antar arama, one who's satisfaction, delight, joy is within. Antarjyotir, one whose light is within, one whose joy is within, one whose happiness is within. Sayogi, Brahma Nirvanam. That yogi is in Brahma Nirvana. Brahma Bhuto Adhigachati. And that yogi becomes Brahman. Remember when I said before you could say the soul was Brahman? Remember when I said that at the beginning of class? I said you could describe the soul as Atma. You could say it's Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti means the soul. You can also describe the soul as Atma, the self. And you can also describe the soul as Brahman. You remember when I said that at the beginning of class? It's an unusual statement to make because usually Brahman is used to refer to God. But not always. Brahma Bhuto means being Brahman. Adhigachati, he goes to, becomes Brahman. Because the self is also spiritual. This verse is quite profound in that it indicates that you are a complete spiritual unit on your own, such that you can find happiness within yourself instead of happiness outside of yourself. For about 5 billion people in the world, 99.9% of Christians and 99.9% of Muslims, which together is about 5 billion people, 2/3 of the world's population, the self, you, fundamentally, are not complete. You can't find happiness within yourself. You're fundamentally broken or sinful, and you require a relationship with Jesus in order to complete you. Because Adam and Eve messed up, and everybody's messed up since then. So that would be called a fractured soul theory, that the soul is fundamentally fractured and requires an external relationship in order to complete itself. Here we have something different. We have the idea that there is joy, there is happiness, there is satisfaction, there is light within you. Antarjyoti, the light within you, one who has the light within themselves. Antarsukha, one who has joy within himself, happiness within themselves. Antararama, one who has their pleasure within themselves. Of course, pleasure and happiness are synonyms, are they not? Are pleasure and happiness synonyms? Certainly they are. But so it's either redundant, because it says you find your happiness within, you find your satisfaction or joy or pleasure within, and then you find your light within. So you could say it's redundant. It's not wrong to say that. You could also say that happiness refers to, I don't know, satisfaction. And then arama means pleasure. It's more than just merely satisfaction. It's more than being sated or satiated. It's now some positive pleasure. You could break the words up like that. You could say, oh, this one means this and this one means that. Sanskrit, just like most languages, you can parse language a little bit. You can say, I love someone and I adore them. Is that merely redundant? Could be. Or you could say, when I say I love them, I mean this. And when I say I adore them, I mean this. I love them and I like them also. You follow? You can say, you can love your family but not like them, but I love this person and I also like them. So you can find your happiness in something, but it's not pleasurable. Maybe you find happiness in doing your duty. That's not necessarily pleasurable. Pleasurable means it's actually enjoyable. But something can make you happy. You can train yourself to be happy by doing the right thing, even if the right thing is painful to do. But this is saying it's both creating happiness. There's happiness within you, and there's joy within you. So you can say the words are the same. You can say the words are different. It's up to you. But this is what the verse says: one whose happiness is within, who is active and rejoices within, and whose aim is inward, is actually the perfect mystic. He is liberated in the Supreme and ultimately attains the Supreme. There you go. That's the verse. The verse also says Brahma Nirvanam. Nirvana is very, very popular in Buddhist texts. But it's not that the term nirvana did not exist in Sanskrit prior to it being co-opted and used in Buddhism. Buddhist texts are primarily written in Pali. Pali is a form of Prakrit. It's a common layperson's form of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was also a spoken language, but it's a little bit more of a formal language. Prakrit was mainly spoken by villagers. But the languages have the same, basic roots. They're very, very similar. And so Pali is a Prakrit language. In many ways, it uses the philosophical language of Sanskrit in a kind of simplified way. So like Atma in Sanskrit, which is very similar to Alma in Spanish. The word Alma means soul in Spanish. Became Atta. Atta. You follow? Anatta means no self. That's a Buddhist doctrine. Anatta. Or Sutra became Satta. So the language just got kind of simplified a little bit. The language got simplified a little bit. So nirvana is a Sanskrit word which is used in Buddhist texts, and it means to extinguish. Because the goal of Buddhism is voidism, to extinguish your existence. It's atheism, but it's not free. Like you're going to reincarnate and go to hell and suffer and enjoy and come back again and again. And to become nothing, you got to work at it. So it's voidism, it's atheism, but it's not free. We would consider it to be religious because it believes in something other than the physical world. It believes in subtle matter, but really that makes you paranormal. It doesn't make you spiritual. It doesn't believe in some fundamental spiritual existence. Rather, it believes in paranormal stuff. Like imagine if you were an atheist, but you believed in ghosts. You follow? Believing in ghosts doesn't mean you believe in God or the soul or eternality or anything. It just means you believe that if you don't do it right, you can come back, become a ghost, and be stuck around for a while. So it's not physical because it believes in some subtler forms of matter, but it's more a paranormal phenomenon than a full spiritual phenomenon. So nirvana, the Buddhist term, the kind of standard term, and it's a negative term, to blow out, to extinguish. It's a via negativa term. It's an apophatic term. It's a neti term. It's a term which is used to indicate negation. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That statement, nothing but the truth, is a negative way of saying the truth. The truth, the whole truth, because you could say the truth, but not the whole truth. Tell the truth. The truth is that, Bailey punched me. Now you're guilty of assault. The whole truth, right? I pulled a gun on you and berated you, and then you punched me. Now I'm guilty of a crime. You're not guilty of anything. Nothing but the truth. Okay, there was no gun. I made fun of you and then you punched me. Now you're guilty again, but maybe of a lesser crime, depending on how mean I was. Truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth. There's meaning to each one of those things. But nothing but the truth is a way of defining something by saying what it's not, by getting rid of things which might be added in, which should not be there. It's a negative term. You're describing what it should not be. You follow? So sometimes you do that. You'll describe what something should not be. So nirvana is a negative term. Brahma comes from bri, it means to grow, and it's a positive term. Brahman is used in Hinduism to designate the soul, to designate God. Depending on the context, it means a bunch of different things. It can also mean the Vedas. It can also mean matter, even though it's spirit. Mahat Brahma would be a term for matter. It's used in the Gita as well. You got to look at the context and know what's being described, and commentaries also help. But it's an interesting compound. Brahma, nirvana, a positive statement, a negative statement, put together. It's a cool philosophical term. It's a positive term for God, indicating growth, indicating the origin of everything, and then at the same time it's a negative term, which means getting rid of everything. In other words, everything material. Sometimes nirvana by itself leads to voidism. There is nothing. Brahma nirvana is clear that what you're getting rid of is the negative, the material, but there's still some positive thing to attach yourself to. Questions, discussion on this verse? So, without all that, we did a pretty good breakdown of the Sanskrit of the verse, but without that breakdown, it's pretty simple. The verse is saying that a self-realized person finds their light, their happiness, their joy, their satisfaction within themselves, which indicates that you are a spiritual being. They extinguish what they're not, and they become who they are. It's a description of that yogi. Sa yogi Brahma Nirvana Adhigachati. He goes to Brahma Nirvana. Brahma Bhuta. He's become Brahman. Now, if you say someone became Brahman, is that concerning to you as a devotee? If somebody says he became Brahman? Is that concerning to you? It would be to you. I'm asking these two gentlemen. Is that concerning to you if somebody says, oh, so-and-so became Brahman? Would that bother you? It should bother you. But you're not saying anything. I don't understand. I'm confused. You speak English. I'm asking you. Does it disturb you if somebody says he became Brahman? Why does it disturb you? There you go, right? That's saying he became God, right? But clearly that's not what it means. Because the Gita does make a strong distinction between Krishna and the individual soul, a very strong distinction. Krishna says, Dvavimau Purushau Loke, Kshara Akshara Evacha, that there are two types of beings in this world, fallen and liberated. Kshara Sarvani Bhutani, Kutasta Akshara Uchate, that everyone is fallen, but then the person who is Kutasta, who's standing on the peak, he is Akshara, Uchate, he's called Akshara. Then he says, what is it? Dvavimau Purushau Loke, Kshara Akshara Evacha, Kshara Sarvani Bhutani, Kutasta Akshara. Uttama Purusha tu Anya, but the Supreme Being is different. Uttama Purusha, the Supreme Being, tu, but Anya, he is different. Who's he different than? The liberated soul and the conditioned soul. Uttama Purusha tu Anya, Bibharti Avyayam Ishwaram. He is maintained in the world. Yo Lokatrayam Avisha, he's entered into this world. Vibharti Avyam Ishram, he's inexhaustibly the Lord, he's always been the Lord. What is it? Uttama Purusha tu Anya? Uttama Purusha tu Anya? Somehow my memory is betraying me. Paramatma iti udahrita. Uttama Purusha tu Anya, Paramatma iti udahrita. He's known as Paramatma, not Atma, Paramatma. Yo lokachayam avishya, bibharti avyam ishwaram. He's the one who enters in this world and maintains it and is inexhaustibly the Lord. Then, aksharat atitoham, Tasmat kshara atitoham, because I'm beyond the fallen people. Akshad apichotama, I'm also beyond the liberated people. Then ata loke vedecha, therefore in this world and in the Vedas, Purushottama, what is it? Ata loka cha vedecha Pratita Purushottama, I'm celebrated as Purushottama, the Supreme Being. Yomam evam asamudo janati Purushottama. If you know me as the Supreme Being, sasarvavit, you know everything. And then bhajati mam sarva bhavena, and you worship me with all your heart. Iti guhyatamam shastram. This is the greatest secret of all scriptures. So the Gita makes a very clear distinction between even a liberated soul and Krishna. Because Uttama Purusha tu Anya, the Supreme Being, is different than the liberated being. How is he different? Yolokachayam avisha, he's entered into this world. Bibharti, he's maintaining it. Avyayam Ishwaram, he's always the Lord. He's inexhaustibly the Lord. Tasmakshara atitoham, he's beyond the fallen soul. Aksharapicha, he's beyond the liberated soul. Therefore, he's known as Purushottam, the Supreme Being. And if you know that, sasarvavit, you know everything. And iti guhyatamam shastram, that's the greatest secret of all scriptures. That there is a Supreme Lord, who's different than you, even in a liberated state. Now that we've clarified that point, when it says here you become Brahman, it just means you don't become the Supreme Brahman. You don't become Param Brahman, Param Brahman, Param Brahma. You follow? In fact, Krishna even says, Brahmano hi pratishtaham, I am the foundation of Brahman, meaning I'm beyond Brahman. So we normally think of the word Brahman as being used to indicate God, but in fact the word Brahman is used in the Gita to also indicate the individual soul. That shouldn't scare us, because we know the place where Krishna explains that even though the soul may also be Brahman, may also become Brahman, it doesn't become Krishna. Did you follow this? It doesn't become the source of Brahman. It doesn't become the source of all reality. And so there's still room within saying you become Brahman for also saying there's still a Supreme Brahman. There's still a source of Brahman. There's still a source of all reality. And therefore we don't have to butcher the language of the Gita. We can rejoice and appreciate the language of the Gita without feeling threatened by it. Did you follow this? All right. So what do we got in this verse? The self-realized soul. Self-realized soul finds their light, happiness, and joy within. They cut away who they're not. They attain Brahman. They become Brahman. It's like a very high level of realization. And that's possible through doing your duty, but not being attached to the results. Labante Brahma Nirvanam Rishaya Kshina Kalamasha. The rishis, the sages, have gotten rid of all the dirt in their hearts, and they have achieved Brahma Nirvana. China Dvaidva Yatatmana. They've cut off all dualities, heat and cold, pleasure and pain, happiness and stress. They're beyond all that. They're higher than that. Yatata Atmanaha. They have controlled selves. Sarva Bhuta Hite Rataha. They rejoice. They find great, they're very attached. Rata means attachment. Rati is used commonly in Sanskrit to mean sexual love. Rati. Very often is used to mean, primarily actually, is used to mean sexual love. It means intense physical enjoyment. Rata, attachment. They're attached to what? Sarva Bhuta Hite. They're attached to doing good for all beings. They're attached to philanthropic, munificent endeavors, to uplifting the world, to benefiting others. Sarva Bhuta, all beings, hite, in the uplifting, in the nourishing, in the benefiting of all living beings. Rata, they're attached to that. It's an interesting point because it means that philanthropic work, spiritual philanthropic work, uplifting people, benefiting people, is not necessarily a material thing. If you love somebody as a soul and you dedicate your life to uplifting them, and that welfare work, that upakar, that welfare, para upakar, that welfare work for the benefit of another, that is spiritual. And so what you're getting here, and this is the only place actually in the Gita where it makes this point, that you do spiritual work to uplift other people. That's part of the nature of a self-realized soul. They're beyond dualities. They're controlled. Their selves are controlled. They've gotten rid of all the dirt in their hearts. And they live their lives to help other people. This is more of an elucidation on what it means to become Brahman, to attain Brahman. It's some details of what is involved in becoming Brahman, becoming spiritualized, becoming self-realized. Those who are beyond dualities that arise from doubts, whose minds are engaged within, who are always busy working for the welfare of all living beings, and who are free from all sins, they achieve liberation in the Supreme. Kama Krodha Vimuktanam Yatinam Yatta Chetasam Abhito Brahma Nirvanam Vartate Vidita Atmanam. Vidita Atmanam. To a knowledgeable soul. For a knowledgeable soul. Who is Yatta Chetasam. Yatinam Yatta Chetasam. Who's an ascetic whose mind is controlled. It's a play on words. Yatinam Yatta Chetasam. The same root. He is a sage whose mind is controlled. Abhito Brahma Nirvanam Vartate. Brahman comes near for that person. Brahma Nirvana comes very near to that person. Kama Krodha Vimuktanam. Who's liberated from lust and anger. Kam, Krodh. These two things. Lust to enjoy people and material things, and Krodh, anger when that enjoyment does not last. You know, it's interesting, but testosterone, the basic male sex hormone, it's funny, but all fetuses, all eggs, all ovums are female. Women have 2 X chromosomes. We have 1 pair of sex chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes altogether that contain all the DNA information for a human being. Other animals have different amounts of chromosomes. Chromosomes carry DNA information. And we have 23 pairs. And 22 of them are non-sex. They're the same. One of them carries. So it's a very small amount of information that's specific to the sexes. And so women have 2 X's. Their pair of sex chromosomes are both X's. And men will always have 1 X, and then they also can have 1 X or 1 Y. If they have a second X there, then that sperm merges with that ovum, it becomes a female child. If that's a Y, then the X here drops off, and you become a male. And so really females are the base sex. They're the default sex. And then to become a male is to be a female, and then something happens to you. And what happens to you is you have testosterone. And then your female genitalia, which are on the inside, get bigger and they become they protrude externally. You're the same basic model. Like the model of a woman is the default model for all human beings. And then if you add testosterone in the womb, along with some other hormones, but primarily testosterone, androgens, then it becomes a male. Shifting in your thought process, in your brain function. The left side of your brain thinks in language, and the right side of your brain thinks much more spatially and more mathematically, and it's systemized, as opposed to much more thoughtful and verbal and abstract. So there's a rightward shift in subcortical functioning. a rightward shift. So you become less adept at language. In fact, women everywhere in the world, as a sex, score higher than men in verbal skills. And verbal skills means they listen better, and they speak better, and they read better, and they write better. Everywhere in the world, if you do a study of men and women as a class, not each woman is better than each man, that would be ridiculous. But just as men are taller than women everywhere you look in the world. Not every man is taller than every woman, but as a group, 1,000 men will be taller than 1,000 women. Follow? Women always outperform men in verbal skills. Men outperform in spatial skills, specifically rotational skills. Theorizing how you would move an object around to fit it into something. Those kind of questions you get asked. And so when you have a lot of testosterone in your body, then you get male genitalia, but you also have this rightward shift in your brain function, and you have suboptimal arousal. Testosterone creates suboptimal arousal, which means men get bored. And they're always looking for something new. And they perform poor in school. Women outperform men in school everywhere in the world. Men take more drugs and alcohol than women everywhere in the world. Men have more extramarital affairs than women do everywhere in the world. If you have two women together, like a gay couple, there's only an 11% chance that they're going to cheat on each other. If you put two men together, a gay couple, 77% chance they're going to cheat on each other. So men are twice as likely as women to cheat, 6 to 12%. But you get two men together, and that 12% becomes 77%. Because men walk around suboptimally aroused all the time, which means they're always bored. ADHD, way more common amongst men. Violent crimes, 4 to 1, men to women. Autism, 2.5 to 10 times more for men, depending on the type of autism. Suicide, 3.8%, 3.8 times. 78% of suicides are men. Bored, unsatisfied. It's fun than masculine because men, by their very constitution, are designed to be wandering and looking for satisfaction. Men take many more financial risks than women do. Just across the board. Thrill-seeking behavior, aggression, violent crimes especially. Crimes in general, violent crimes especially. And so this idea of overcoming desire and anger, it's no joke for anybody. In some ways, you're going against your basic constitution. It's really swimming uphill to live a life where you're not just running around manipulated by desire and anger. Testosterone also makes you less susceptible to pain. It also makes you less empathetic. There's a reduction in empathy. Women score higher on empathy than men do, which is really heavy. It's really problematic. Empathy is a super important quality. So this, in a lot of ways, what's being described here, self-realization, it's you're being empathetic, you're trying to help other people, you're satisfied, you're okay, you don't need anything from external, you're peaceful. In some ways, it's almost the opposite of how men differ from women. It's a very feminine description of self-realization. Did you follow that? It's a beautiful verse, actually. If you can live free from desire and lust. If you are an ascetic, you're a saintly person who strives for self-control, whose mind is self-controlled, then Brahma Nirvana comes very close for you. Because you're a soul who knows what's really going on, what's really important, and you can withstand these material temptations. Those who are free from anger and all material desires, who are self-realized, self-disciplined, and constantly endeavoring for perfection, they are assured of liberation in the Supreme in the very near future. See that language, liberation in the Supreme? Do you like that language? Sir, do you like that language? Liberation in the Supreme? No, you're not supposed to like it. Your mind's not moving fast enough. Do you like that language, liberation in the Supreme? No, you don't. You don't like it. Because do we want to merge into Krishna? Liberation in the Supreme. Becoming Brahman. Liberation in... We don't like that, right? But there's nothing wrong with it. There's only something wrong with it when it says liberation in the Supreme, becoming Brahman, and you are Krishna. And you in every way become one with Brahman. But we say, Brahma Bhuta Prasanatmana Sochatina Kangshi Samasaveshi Buddhi Mad Bhaktim Labate Param. Then you get bhakti. After you become Brahman, then you get bhakti. Param Bhakti. Supreme bhakti, supreme devotion. So clearly, when Krishna speaks of becoming Brahman, of merging into the oneness, he's not speaking of something which extinguishes your individual existence. He's rather saying you become fully spiritualized such that you can then associate with and love the Supreme. Two people fall in love and you refer to them as a couple. You think of them as a couple. That doesn't mean you think that they are literally the same person and they have no individual existence. Rather, it means their closeness is such that you think of them together at the same time. And that's a beautiful thing. Who are those two? No, they're a couple. They're not two people. They're a couple. Oh, they're a couple. Oh, so nice. But that doesn't mean you think that they've literally, in every way, become one person, like a Siamese twin, where your existence, like merges in the other person. There's no two people. It just means that you're so close. We should not make it so that Krishna can't speak in this beautiful, profound language, poetic language that communicates a very sweet state of existence because of our fear of monism and everything becoming one. Krishna's very comfortable talking about types of oneness that don't mean an absolute oneness, where there's no room for difference. And of course, if there's no room for difference, then there's no room for love, because love ties two people together, but it's based on them being different. If love exists forever, then we have to be different than God forever in order to love Him. Sparsha kritva bahir bahyams chakshusha shavantare bruvaho. Your gaze is going inwards towards your brow. Like this. Look at my eyes. Like this. Like that. You're not looking outwards. You're looking inwards. You follow? And sparsha kritva bahir bahyams. You've shut out external touching, external enjoyment. And you focused your gaze on your eyebrows, in between your eyebrows. Chakshusha antare bruvo, in between the eyebrows. In between the eyebrows. Prana apana samau kritva, and you've made your ingoing breath and your outgoing breath. This air which is moving in your nose, inhaling and exhaling, you've made it the same. You've regulated your breathing through pranayama. You've regulated your prana, and your apana. You've regulated that. What does this sound like? Sounds like meditation, right? You're focusing your gaze in between your eyebrows. You've shut out the external world. And you're controlling your breathing. Yatendriya mano buddhir munhir moksha parayana. You are dedicated to liberation. It's the most important thing to you. Moksha parayana. You are a person for whom moksha is the most important thing. Parayana means dedicated to, holding it as the highest object. Moksha parayana. You are dedicated to moksha. And you are yatendriya mano buddhi. You are a person whose senses, mind, and intellect are all controlled. Vigata icha bhaya krodha. And you are a person who has gotten rid of desire, fear, and anger. Yata yasada mukta eva saha. A person like that, he's always liberated. A person like that is always liberated. So it's interesting here, but what's being described is really very similar to the kinds of pranayama, yoga practices that are just traditionally done on the Indian spiritual landscape. Very similar to Buddhist practices, very similar to Sufi practices. It's kind of just quieting the mind, shutting out external stimuli, looking within. And then here's the verse. Bhoktaram yagya tapasam. I am the enjoyer. Bhoktaram yagya tapasam. The enjoyer of all yagna and tapas. The enjoyer of all sacrifice and the enjoyer of all austerity. Sarva loka maheshwaram. The great Lord of all the worlds. Suhridham sarva bhutanam. The great friend of all living beings. The well-wishing friend of all living beings. Suhrit, very dear to the heart. All living beings are dear to Krishna. Yatvamam, if you know me like that, shantim richiti, you become peaceful. This verse is amazing because after all this talk about becoming Brahman and being Brahman, then you get this verse, which clearly demonstrates that Krishna does not mean anything like an absolute oneness. Because we still have here Krishna special. And you don't have to know Krishna special. Who's Krishna? He's the great Lord of all the worlds. He's the enjoyer of all your spiritual practices. He's everyone's best friend. Remember when Krishna said you should be everyone's best friend and help other people and be attached to that? Why is that? Because Krishna is everyone's best friend. So if you're following Krishna, then you should also be everyone's best friend in service to Krishna. Yatvamam, having known me like that, shantim richati, you become peaceful. It's amazing, but these verses, which have this incredibly, difficult process of self-realization being recommended, a very advanced process of self-realization, they culminate in a realization of the nature of divinity, the nature of God. As powerful. Sarva Loka Maheshwaram, the great Lord of everything. But also intimate. Suhridam Sarvabhutam, the best friend of all living beings. And the ultimate reason why you're doing everything. You're moksha parayana, you're dedicated to liberation, but ultimately you're dedicated to the person who is liberation personified, and that is Krishna. And understanding that, having that knowledge, brings peace. To know Him is to love Him. Know the truth, for it shall set you free. This is a piece of knowledge. If you understand this, then you become peaceful, you become happy, you become joyous. In some ways, it's a contrast to this very, very difficult process of self-realization, or you can just know Krishna, and that's enough to make you happy. Or alternatively, after you go through this process, you'll eventually become able to realize Krishna, and then you'll truly become happy. But it's an indispensable part of the self-realization process of understanding the nature of God. And the Gita has verses like this in every chapter. It'll discuss things in terms, and you'll start to think, oh, Krishna seems to be describing something which is a little less personal than I like. But then a verse like this will always come along that makes it clear that everything that's being described is always against the backdrop of devotion. You're dedicated to liberation? Here's liberation personified. Incarnation of liberation. You have all these spiritual practices? Here's the person who enjoys, who eats those spiritual practices. Bhoktara means the eater of all these things you're doing. He's the one who's going to enjoy it. And once you realize that everything you're doing is meant for the pleasure of Krishna, then you become liberated. Because it's actually the reality. There is a source of all existence. There is a source of you. There is a source of all love. Love is divine, which means that individuality has to exist. And when you understand that, you understand that everything you're doing is for a purpose, and that purpose is a person, then that becomes liberation. The devotees in the late 60s took this verse. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifice and austerity, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, that person attains peace from the pangs of material existence. The devotees in the late 60s, so we're talking over 50 years ago, 55 years ago, maybe 1968, 67, 68, they took this verse, this single verse, and they printed it out on a mimeograph. This is before there were copy machines. They had mimeographs, like a preliminary copy machine, printed in like a greenish colored ink. And they printed this out, and they would take it out to the UN, where the Vietnam War was being protested. And they would pass out, and they called it the peace formula, because it says you achieve peace. So they called the verse the peace formula. And then, everybody who was protesting the war would be like, oh, I'm into peace, what's the peace formula? And they would read this verse. And it was a way they did outreach. This was a super important verse for the early devotees. It's a big part of their outreach. And it's still as powerful now as it was then, as when it was spoken. It's a beautiful verse. It stands alone, just like the Gita stands alone, but when you understand, you look at the verses around it, it becomes more beautified. Like a diamond becomes beautified by the gold that surrounds it. So if we read these verses and we come across this verse, it's like a valuable gem set in the gold of the Gita, and then this verse becomes particularly beautiful at the end of the chapter. Final thoughts? This is your favorite verse. Just see. Krishna's mercy. You come, and then we're talking about that verse. Amazing, right? Sadhu, sadhu. Thank you. What is your name? Ranti Dev. Ranti Dev. Nice to meet you, Ji. Nice to meet you. More thoughts? Comments, questions, discussion? Yes.
Like the verses we read, why the impersonalists, they can't understand this?
Because they're stupid.
They're too stupid.
I mean, the Gita is not particularly difficult Sanskrit. The Gita is a very simple Sanskrit. It's not that every verse is super easy to understand, but these verses that we just read are super easy to understand. Most of the Gita is like very beginner level Sanskrit. No, what happens is this, is that it is not that the impersonalists love the Gita. Rather, they know other people think the Gita is important, and therefore they do some tika, some commentary on the Gita. But they're not really trying to understand the Gita. They're just telling you their own thoughts, and they're using the Gita as a tool to teach their own lessons. Politicians will do this. They'll go into a soup kitchen, and there's poor people are there, and they're getting some food. They'll come in with cameras, and they'll serve a few people food. Then they'll hug a couple babies, and then they'll walk out. They don't love those people. They love the photo opportunity. So I think for the most part, honestly speaking, the impersonalists, the Gita is inconvenient for them. They give some commentary, but the Gita is not it's not their friend. It's a little antagonistic to their worldview. For us, we can embrace the Gita, including the verses that seem a little impersonal, because we always know where they're going to head. There's no danger. We have a lot in common with Krishna. That's why we can go back to heaven and be with Krishna, because we have so much in common. If we were completely distinct from Krishna, there'd be no way to love Krishna. You have to be a little bit alike in order to love Krishna. So we have some things in common. Krishna's eternal, we're also eternal. Krishna's all good, we're also all good. And we have many things in common with Krishna. We're just not the origin of the cosmos. And so there's also room for distinction. But honestly, it's difficult to misinterpret the Gita. It's difficult. It takes work. They have to really get weird with the verses. Some of their commentaries are just ridiculous. More thoughts? Yeah.
I really appreciated learning about
Sankhya Yoga?
yes, and also separate from that, just uplifting people, attachments, uplifting people, and serving people.
Were you going to say Sankhya Yoga or were you going to say uplifting people?
Well, I was going to ask that after this.
I don't know what that means. Were you going to say Sankhya Yoga or uplifting
I
people?
was going to say uplifting people and then come around to something.
You were going to come around to that. Okay.
But knowing
Yeah.
it's not material attachment, and that's part of becoming self-realized.
It might be material. You might help people. Let's say people have a drug problem and you counsel them and you're helping people. That could be your own issues. You're running from your troubles. You're trying to help people because you can't help yourself. It could be you're busying yourself helping other people so you don't have to stop and think about your own stuff and get into your own head. It could be because you want to become famous as this selfless person. It could be because the people you're helping are hoping to find a husband. Maybe you'll meet some guy there. You're counseling somebody. You'll help somebody get sober and then you'll marry them. Of course, you're married already, so I'm just speaking hypothetically. You could ruin something with your material desires. But the act of helping people in and of itself does not have to be material. And especially if you're helping people to realize things like this, that they're a spiritual being, that God loves them, things like that. Those things are entirely spiritual. You can still adulterate them. You can still mess them up by putting your own issue into them. But it's not that helping people or being in this world or interfacing with this world or doing things for other people or engaging with other people is necessarily degrading. It's not necessarily degrading. It can actually be uplifting. It can be a symptom of your love for Krishna, who's the ultimate benefactor, who's the ultimate well-wisher, who's the ultimate person helping people. It's interesting, but Krishna says, I am the enjoyer of everything you're doing, and then also, I love you so much. We're about to serve dinner, if you want to stay for dinner. And he's saying, I'm the enjoyer of everything. He's also saying, and I love you so much. It's an interesting combination where he's indicating a reciprocal relationship. More thoughts? Yeah.
Earlier in the chapter, I guess they did mention it recently, but they talked about extinguishing things that were not, and that these material qualities of greed and anger, that they're not fundamental to who we are. But I liked when you mentioned that Krishna says for us to be the well-wisher and best friend of everyone. And he says that because that's him. He is that. And so we can actually act.
You're following Krishna's lead.
Yes.
You're becoming Krishna-like. You're moving in this world the way Krishna exists. And in that way, you're becoming more divine. Excellent. You got it. Thank you very much. Let's have some prasad.